Thanks for joining, everyone. In today's tutorial, we're going to be sort of going over how to create the scene that's on the screen at the moment. So sort of building it up from the ground up. This will be in cycles, though you can probably get relatively similar results in Eevee. And just a quick caveat, I'm using a slightly older version of Blender, just because it's a little bit more stable, at least for me right now. So if you have switched over to the new version of Blender, like your mileage kind of may vary with any sort of lighting values I give or type into my version of Blender, because in the new version of Blender, Blender 4.0 and 4.1 or whatever the latest one is, they've slightly changed how cycles, at least, I think, calculates the ray tracing, so how it calculates light. So it may not be exactly parallel to kind of some of the figures on your sort of side, but hopefully it's not too disastrous. So yeah, we'll be going through some basic modeling techniques to model some of the candy canes that you see in the front here, a basic look at lighting, and also a particle system to create the snowflakes that you see kind of falling down around him. And then a bit of a basic look at the shader editor. So I'm just going to pull this up in the bottom of my screen. So this thing down here, we'll get into that a little bit later. Kind of like an introduction to what this thing is and how to add things to it and change things. As usual, if anyone's got any questions, just drop them in the chat as we go along, especially if you're trying to follow along, and I'll try and answer them. I can always go back as well and try and troubleshoot as we go along. If I don't know the answer, I'll try and find it for you as well. And I will try to remember to call out all the shortcuts as I go along, but sometimes it's a little bit tricky. So if I miss something and it wasn't clear, just drop a message and I'll repeat whatever happened. So let's get into it. So yeah, this is the end result we're going to shoot for. So I've already done this once over, and I'll just start from a blank file again and do it again. Though I won't start a completely new file, I'll just basically hide the practice run and then I'll do it again. So I'm just going to hide this folder. So I'm going to hide everything except for my beast here. So this is just going to use the standard GLB beast. So you don't need a T-pose, although if you want to pose your character and set it up in the scene and doing something fun, then, you know, crack on. But just for the sake of simplicity in these tutorials, it's kind of easier just to start with something that everyone has access to and doesn't need to edit or change, especially if we're just doing a still image rather than animation. So if you don't know how to import a beast, it's just file, import, and then import whichever file type you've got, either your FBX or your GLB, and then go from there. And then I've just grouped all the parts to that beast and put them in a folder, put them in a collection over here on the right-hand side in the outliner. It's important to kind of keep a tidy outliner, you know, organize things in folders. It just ends up helping you a lot further down the line when things start building up and you can't find various bits of your file. So I will, if you've started a new file, you'll start with a cube rather than your beast, and you'll start with a light and a camera. So I'll just add back in a light, just a standard point light here, and then Shift A, and I'll add back in a, what was the other thing I said was in here? Oh, a camera. And I'll add back in a camera. So there you go. So you'll have these three things in your scene. You'll have your beast, your camera, and your point light. So then the next thing I'm going to do is just create a bit of a ground plane for my beast to sit on. So because I've already been playing around with this file, my 3D cursor was somewhere else. If you start from a blank file, it will start right at the middle, so the X, Y, and Z 0, 0, 0 coordinates right in the middle. But mine's all the way over here at the moment. If I shift right click, I can move it anywhere, but I want it back in the center just for the sake of consistency and simplicity if you're starting from a new file. So to do that, Shift S, bring up to this menu, and you want this one over here, which is cursor to world origin, and you'll see that this thing has snapped back in here. So now any items or any mesh that I add, or any cameras or lights, whatever, will add with their origin point in the center here. So Shift A, mesh at the top, plane, just add in a ground plane. I want it to be slightly bigger, so I'll press S to scale, and I'll just scale it up. It doesn't need to be massive, somewhere around here maybe. And then I will just apply that scale. So because I edited the scale of that object in object mode, or sorry, that mesh in object mode, Blender doesn't know that this is the scale that I want it to be. So if I just press Ctrl A, I can just apply the scale. So now Blender knows that this is it's 111 in terms of the relative scale, which just removes a few issues like further down the line. So then the next thing is we're going to add in a bunch of subdivisions on this plane. So if I tab into edit mode, you'll know when you're in edit mode because you can select the faces. So up here in the top left, or the shortcuts 1, 2, and 3 on your keyboard will cycle between vertex selection mode, which is number 1, 2, which is edge select mode, and 3, which is face select mode. So you'll know when you're in edit mode because you'll be able to select various different corners of things, of different meshes. So I just want to subdivide this. So I want to basically add in some loop cuts all the way along in both directions. And the quickest way to do this is to make sure you're in object mode. So tab back into object mode, right click, and then, in edit mode. So tab back into edit mode, select your face, or you can select all the vertices, doesn't really matter. Select your face, right click, and then subdivide, which is the 5th one down. And it will bring up this little menu at the bottom here. And you'll see you can slide the scale from 1 to 10. I believe you can type in any number. So you can type in 20, 40, whatever. And somewhere around here. So I'm just going to type in 40. That gives me enough kind of data, enough points, enough vertices on this plane to kind of work with and do a bunch of things. So next, obviously, if you're on, unless you're on a concrete pavement or something, ground has irregularity. So we want to introduce some irregularity to the surface here. So there are a number of different ways to do this. I mean, ultimately, this way is not super. I mean, it's a bit sort of a bit kind of MacGyver. I don't know if that's the right word, but it's a little bit of a bodge, but it doesn't really matter how you do this. You could do this with a displacement map, you could do it with whatever. But in the sense of just getting familiar with panning around and using some of the tools, I'm going to do it this way for the virtue of the tutorial. So I'm going to just make sure I'm in face select mode. So I'm going to hit 3 on my keyboard, and you'll see I can then just select all of these faces. Doesn't really matter. And then I'm going to shift select a bunch of random ones all the way around here, all the way around this surface, with no real intent as to where I'm selecting them. And then I'm going to go over here up to the top. So in and amongst all the stuff up here is this little button right here, which kind of looks like a target symbol. And this thing is proportional editing. So when you tick that on, it will go blue. Now, when you try and do anything to these faces that you've selected, so if you move them in any way, other things will be affected too. So if I press G to grab and then move, so G and then Z maybe to lock it into the Z-axis, you can see at the moment it's grabbing all of those things and also some of the surrounding vertices. And this giant circle that's appeared, it's kind of like a sphere of influence. So if you scroll on your mouse wheel, it will reduce the circle of influence. So you can see the circle of influence is super small, so it's only really affecting the immediately connecting vertices. And then as soon as I increase this circle, it starts to affect more and more and more of those vertices around the ones that you've initially selected. So if you want to make loads of little molehills for some reason, you can do this. If you want to make it into peaks and troughs and valleys, you can have a really large one, whatever it might be. I'm going to end up somewhere around here maybe. And then I'm just going to click to apply that. And then I'm going to do that once more, just for like the sake of a little bit more variation. So I'm just going to shift select a bunch of random things all the way around, a bunch of random squares all the way around, G and then Z. And I'm going to move these down slightly now, just so there's even more kind of variation. Cool. So we've got a kind of, I don't know, a little bit of a ground plane going on there. It's looking a little bit faceted right now, so we'll just right click and shade smooth. Cool. So we've kind of got a ground plane. Maybe now we want a little bit more variety, so we might want to add some really basic rocks. So we're obviously going to cover this entire surface in snow. So the more kind of variation you have on it, the more it will kind of almost look like snow, because, you know, snow collects on the top of objects, so the top of anything on the scene. So that might be a rock, it might be the ground, it might be a beast's head, it might be the candy cane, the top of the candy cane. So anywhere where we can start to kind of introduce irregularity means that we'll probably get a more convincing scene when we come to lay the snow down over the top of it. So I'm just going to add in another object. So right now I'm just also going to move this plane. So because I had this collection selected, it's put the plane and the camera and the light that I made all into this collection, which currently has all the mesh data for my beast in there. I don't really want those in there, I want those kind of separately. So I'm just going to shift select them all and drag them out into the higher kind of level tutorial run folder over here. And I'm just going to name this plane, I'm going to name it ground. So yeah, next I'm going to add in some rocks. I mean, you can do this in a number of ways. I'm just going to do it in the sort of quickest, simplest, sort of low poly method possible. I think there is even a rock generator in as an add-on in Blender if you just want to like literally one-click very realistic looking rock. But for the sake of like having continuity in terms of like the aesthetic of all the different components in the scene, I'm just going to make these rocks. So Shift A, mesh. And then I'm going to go down to, doesn't really matter, you could use a cube if you wanted, but I'm going to go down to UV sphere now. It'll add a UV sphere in the middle of there. And I'm just going to turn down the amount of segments from 32 to, I don't know, 8 or so, maybe. I don't know, maybe a bit more. No, let's go with 8 and turn down the amount of rings to 8 as well. So it's like a low poly beach ball almost. And then I'm just going to confirm that. Just going to move this over to the side over here. So G to grab, and then I'm just going to move it. And then I'm going to do exactly what I did with the ground, but on the rock itself. So I'm going to just pick a bunch of faces around it. Maybe I'll do one at a time just for clarity, but I'll pick a face over here. I'm going to press G to grab, making sure that I've still got proportional editing on. So still got this toggle on up here. G to grab, move the kind of circle of influence back a bit. I'm just going to introduce some, you know, I don't know, your kind of own creative direction at this point, but introduce some irregularity so it starts to look more like a rock shape, less like a beach ball, more like a rock. I'm going to right click and shade smooth. And I'm also going to put a subdivision modifier over this. So at the moment, this is extremely low poly. So this would be great for like a really low poly game asset if you needed to, but we're not really bothered by that. So I'm just going to tell Blender to smooth it even more. So obviously right click and shade smooth if you've already done that. And then I'm going to add a subdivision modifier over the top of it. So I'm going to press Control and then I'm going to press Control 2. And that will add a level 2 subdivision modifier over the top of it. Control 1 would add 1 division, 3, 3, 4, and diminishing returns past a certain point, but 2 for now. And that will add in a modifier. So it will be non-destructive in the sense of if you go over here to the little wrench icon, the modifiers property, the blue wrench on the right-hand side, it will add in this little node or box for you. And if I just turn that on or off, you can see that it's not actually changed any of the data underneath. It's just kind of applying it, a bit like a layer in Photoshop, if people are familiar with that, applying a layer over the top of it. So you can always at any point delete this. You can always at any point change the amount of subdivisions, whatever it might be. So cool, I've got one rock. Maybe I need a few more. So I'm just going to Shift D to duplicate this rock. I'm going to duplicate it over here. And then I'm just going to scale it down maybe so it's not the same size. Maybe I'll rotate it around so it doesn't even look like the same rock anymore. Obviously, we're not really bothered about what's underneath here because we won't see it from the point of view of the camera, so it really doesn't matter. And I'm going to do this a few times. So I'm just snapping to the top view mode over here using this gimbal, so the Z axis, positive, so looking down, and negative would look upwards from the bottom. And I'm going to just do this a few times. So, I mean, you can use your own creative judgment kind of here about what looks good in your scene, how many rocks you want, you know, do you want loads of them? Do you want only a few? You know, do you want smaller ones? Whatever. You can compose this to your heart's desire. Maybe I want a big rock. Maybe I want some small rocks next to it. You know, if I rotate that round, suddenly it doesn't look like the same rock anymore. You know, these two rocks over here, these kind of look like the same rock. So maybe I'll spin that one around. Maybe add another one over here. Doesn't really matter. Cool. So I've got some rocks, got some ground, and we're looking good. So now if I come over here to the outliner, obviously I've got a bunch of these, well, we started with a sphere, so they're all called sphere. For the sake of simplicity in the scene, you could keep these all as separate meshes, separate objects, sorry. I'm just going to join them all together. So I'm going to shift select them all from the outliner here, press Ctrl J, and just join them all together in one thing. So if I tabbed into edit mode, you would see that they're all a part of this one object. So they'll all move as one. You don't have to do this. You could create a collection. So you could create a folder that grouped all of those rocks if you ever wanted to sort of individually move them slightly easier. And then I'm just going to label this rocks. Cool. So we've got the kind of basics of a scene set up. Just going to go through and position the camera. So just set up the kind of composition that you want. So the easiest way to do this, you can select the camera over here. You could G and grab it and position it that way. I personally find it slightly easier to do it another way. So if you press N, N for Nevada, I don't know, is that the right one? N for Nevada, you will open up a menu on the right hand side, and you might not have some of these things down here depending on what add-ons you install, but usually if you install an add-on it will plonk it onto this sidebar. So you'll definitely have the first three. You'll likely maybe also have Blender Kit and some sort of Mixamo add-on perhaps, but you'll definitely have Item Tool and View. You want to go down to View, which is the third one down. Just expand this out so you can read the full name. And then the one you want is this one. So under View Lock, if that's collapsed for you, uncollapse it, and it's Camera to View. And what this will do is if I now jump to and toggle on my camera view, so if I press this button, or if you have a number pad, it's number pad and E0 number. If I press this button, now any movements I make in this view will be also done to the camera. So as I move this around and I position my shot using shift and middle mouse and rotate and all that kind of good stuff, once I tick out of that, sorry, that didn't work because I didn't have the camera actually selected, but you have to have the camera selected first. So select the camera. You can either select it in the scene or you can select it with this, I don't know, this little green sort of film camera icon over here next to the camera itself. Camera to view, dip into your camera, and you'll see I'm now looking through the point of view of that camera, which is all the way over here. And now when I move it around, that camera is now following me around. So I want to just make some sort of square composition maybe. So you can change the focal length and all that sort of stuff with the camera. I'm not going to mess around with that in this tutorial, but you know, if you reduce the focal length, obviously you introduce more perspective into the scene, so you'll be able to see more of the scene if you have a more expansive background. If you flatten off or if you use a higher focal length, you might find this in like portraiture where they go up to like, you know, 75mm focal lengths just to flatten out the face. So if you're doing like a portrait shot or whatever, it tends to look a little bit better than if you were using like a lower 35mm lens on that face. You can see if you get closer to the face, it starts to distort in unusual ways. I'm just going to leave this around about 55. So I'm just going to set up some sort of square composition of my beast where he's kind of cropped, maybe somewhere like that. And then I'm going to untick camera to view. And now when I move around, you'll see that that camera has positioned itself exactly where, wherever I wanted it. And at any point you can go back to that camera view by just making sure you have that camera selected or the camera active, and toggling the camera view either through this button or the number pad 0. Now, we can see that all those rocks that I added in, not many of them are like compositionally in the scene. So at this point, it's potentially useful to compose your scene. So find a composition that works through the viewpoint of the camera. So within the bounds of this square here. So it kind of looks like I need to, move all of my rocks. So I'm going to press G to grab, G and then Y, and move them backwards so that more of them appear in the scene, and then G and then X. Move them over a little bit. And, maybe I actually want to start adding in a few more, whatever, to balance out the scene. I won't do it just for the sake of time on this tutorial, but now I've got a few more of the rocks in the scene, so it's starting to feel a little bit better. Cool, so we've got the basis for the ground and the rocks. And now we're just going to create the snow over the top. So, or maybe we'll create the candy cane first, that might be slightly easier. So we'll create the candy canes, perhaps, first, and then we'll do the snow. So you could, by all means, definitely download a candy cane, and they'll probably look better. Or, download any sort of other Christmassy assets and all that good stuff. Get creative with it. If that's more your thing, if you're into kit bashing or downloading stuff for Blender Kit, that's also fine. But sometimes it's useful to maybe practice some really small modeling exercises, as they sort of just help to build up a bit of speed, build up some shortcuts like, into your muscle memory, and build up some kind of speed in terms of navigating around the software and just comfortably moving around 3D space. So I personally found these quite helpful, these little, side missions, I guess you might call them, using simple stuff. It also means, some of the techniques that you learn while doing these things, you can then start to edit some meshes of models that you download. You can start editing the proportions of those things in a way that's maybe more beneficial for the beasts and things like that. Make them fit a little bit better into the kind of aesthetic of the Kid Called Beast world. So that's a bit of a tangent, but I'm just going to come over here. So I'm just going to move away from all this stuff over here just for the sake of simplicity. And I'm going to shift and right click and bring my 3D cursor over here. Now, any object that I add into the scene will appear with its origin point here. So I'm going to shift A and I'm going to add in a mesh. And I'm going to come down to cylinder, sixth one down. And I'm going to make sure it has 8 sides. So depending on, I think it probably starts with like 32 when you just load this up in a new Blender file, but 8 sides. We don't really need any more. It's always good to work in as little kind of, with as few polys or as few kind of vertices as possible for as long as possible, because it's just much easier to edit and shape and sculpt things the way you want. And then as you kind of move through the process, you sort of ratchet up the amount of detail of the models. So a cylinder with 8 sides. I'm going to just come into a direct side view. So I'm going to look in the y-axis. So I'm just going to, over here in the gimbal, I'm just going to select the green thing here. You can also use control and number pad 1, 2, and 3, I think it is, or 7, 1, 7, and 3 or something like that. I just don't have a number pad, so I can't. Cool, so you've got a bit of a cylinder. Just going to scale it down slightly. And then I'm going to tab into edit mode. I'm going to grab this top face. So make sure I have face selected. So 3 on the number pad. Pick this top face. I'm going to go into a side view. And I'm going to press G and Z. And you can see here, I still have proportional editing on. So as I'm moving it up, it's also dragging all the vertices towards the lower edge up with it as well. So I want to just make sure before I actually grab and move this data that I have proportional editing, which is this little target symbol up here that we used earlier, off. So turn that off, and then G, and then Z, and move it up. So this is going to be the sort of long stem to a candy cane. Now, a candy cane sort of looks like, I don't know, this will be a bad drawing, but something like that. So we're going to mimic that. So I'm going to press A on the keyboard, and that will select all of the model as it is at the moment. So this whole cylinder over here. I'm going to press Shift D to duplicate, D for duplicate, X to lock it in the side, so side to side, and I'm just going to move it over a fraction, so over here. So they're not touching, but they're very close. So there's now two identical cylinders side by side. Now the top of the candy cane loops over, and we'll solve that last, but the kind of termination of the candy cane is somewhere here. So just going to pick this bottom face, similar to how we moved the top face in the other one. Pick this bottom face down here, G and then Z, and move it up. Doesn't need to be exact, just somewhere around there. So now we need to, put something between these two faces that loops over something like this. And there are a number of ways to do this, but the quickest way is to bridge between them and then tell Blender what's going on in the middle, basically. So I'm going to just make sure I have both faces selected. So in face select mode, so 3, while still in edit mode, pick and shift click both faces. And then I'm going to right click, and then go to bridge faces, which is about halfway down. Once you click this, you'll see some stuff happens. It's not exactly what we want. It's added in a flat plane that runs across here, which might be useful in some instances, but is not what we want in this instance. So what we want to do is to tell Blender that this surface over here loops over and connects to this surface here. This surface over here loops over and connects to this one, and it's in sequence around both of those cylinders. Now it's really important that both of these cylinders have the exact same amount of sides, although otherwise this won't work particularly well. But since we duplicated the first cylinder, we know they're exactly the same. So the options we want are down here in interpolation. So this is, there's a few options in here, and they do subtly different things, or potentially quite different things depending on what you're after. The one we want is blend surface. So blend surface will basically take the edge data of this surface, the edge data of this surface, and it will try and match between them. So now we've got this picked. We just need to tell Blender how many loop cuts, so how many slices we want going across it to help it figure out between point A and point B. So we come down here to the number of cuts thing, and you'll see if I start to scroll this up, so 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all the way up to whatever. We obviously don't need 64. We maybe only need something like 8, maybe even less. But you can see it's added in 8 cuts that kind of fan radially from this point here and perfectly join the two. So yeah, we've almost got our candy cane there. Now we'll do what we did on the floor earlier. We'll shift click, shade smooth, and then we'll add a subdivision modifier over the top. So Control 2 adds that in. You could also come over here to your little wrench or spanner, whatever that is, and you could add it manually over here in the modifiers panel itself, which is here. Cool, so it's looking a bit smooth. Obviously, there's some funky stuff going on at the ends. We basically don't have enough information to tell Blender exactly how to hold this shape. So we just need to add some supporting loops kind of here and here. So Control R is the shortcut to add an edge loop. And you'll see as you move your mouse around, it will snap to various kind of points, between points or along points, or as we want to run across. So just gonna pick one here, move it down. You'll see that it starts flattening out the end of that thing. So maybe I'll move it here, and I want another one over here. So same thing, Control R, loop cut down to the bottom. And if you want to get a little bit fancier, you can smooth out the end profiles a little bit more. You can kind of see there's some weird stuff going on here. Again, there's just not enough information on this face to tell Blender exactly how to manage the surfaces or the smoothing of the surfaces at those points. So if you go into face select mode, so with 3, just pick both end faces, press I to inset. You'll see that it starts smoothing out the bottom of that surface a little bit nicer. Cool, so we've got a candy cane, and we've modeled it all the way over here. So we can bring it back, so G and then X to move it over. This next bit is completely up to you. It might be beneficial to have a look through your camera. So if you toggle the camera view, you can see more directly where they kind of are positioned in the scene. And you just want to kind of eyeball something that compositionally looks nice to you. So maybe I want a couple over here, one in the background, maybe one over here, just to fill some space. So exactly what we did with the rocks. Just going to scale this down, rotate it around a bit, rotate in various different axes. This is a little bit like, up for grabs as to what you think looks good, but I'm just going to do a few over here. Maybe I'll go into a top view and I'll put one over here, so it's kind of in the background, and one all the way over here, so it's even further. Go back into my camera view, move them around so you can still see them. Maybe I scale that one down. Maybe I rotate that one around. Cool. We've got a bunch of candy canes knocking around in the scene. And for each of these, I'm just going to select them all individually. Because we were scaling everything outside of edit mode, we just need to tell Blender exactly that. We just need to tell Blender and update their scale essentially. So if I came over here on the N to bring up that panel, if I came over here to item and I selected one of these, you'll see the scale as it currently stands is 0.25, 0.25, 0.25. So the actual scale of this should be 111, which would be massive. So I just need to tell Blender that this new scale that I've scaled it down to is the 111 height, so the true scale of the object. So I'm just going to and I'll need to do this for all of these things. I'm just going to shift select all of these things, press Control A, and then apply the scale. So now if I click into any of these, you'll see that it says 111 on the scale here on the side. And this just avoids some issues later down the line. It's not necessarily a huge problem in this point of the kind of project where you're kind of still building out the scene and all those good things. It becomes a little bit more of a problem with texturing towards the end, texturing and UV maps and things like that. But cool, so now we're going to add the snow. So we're going to add a blanket of snow to the ground. We're going to add some snow to the rocks, and we're going to add some snow to the tops of the candy canes. I'm just going to name some of these maybe. So I know this is candy cane, so I'm just going to call it candy cane. Just call it candy maybe for now. And then I'll just name the other ones the same thing, just to keep it tidy so I know what's what. You could even add these into a collection if you really wanted, but cool. So we're going to add some snow. This is a lot easier than it sounds. So Blender has a really quick and easy way of adding snow into things that also looks quite good. So, and it's free. So you'll need to install this add-on basically. But it comes with Blender by default. So if you go up to Edit and then Preferences, you probably won't be able to see this new window because of how I've got Discord setting up to record, but Edit, Preferences, and then if you go down, about halfway down on the left-hand side, you'll be able to see add-ons. If you click into add-ons, click into the search bar and type snow, you'll see that it brings up one thing, which is object and then real snow. So the add-on is real snow. And you just want to make sure you have that ticked and enabled and that you save your preferences. So once you've done that, it will add in an add-on. It will add on an add-on over here on the right-hand side in this toolbar here. So if you can't see that, it's N for Nevada on the keyboard. As the shortcut hotkey, and you may have to scroll down depending on how many you've got. It might be nearer the top. For me, it's like right towards the bottom. Real snow. So there's not much to this add-on. Basically, you pick the thing that you want the snow on, you tell it how much coverage, so how much snow is on that thing, the height of the snow, so I assume this is sort of in meters or whatever it might be, and you can also select individual faces if you just want to maybe go into this, select all of these faces and only want snow on this bit, for example, but we're not super bothered by that at this point. I mean, maybe we can do it just for the sake of the tutorial. So I'll just tab into edit mode on this ground plane, and I will just literally just select a bunch of random, maybe I'll do it a different way. So if you press W on your keyboard, it will cycle through some selection types. So you'll see the icon in the top left here, and also what's going on with my cursor changes. So as you press W, it cycles through select modes. You can also do that by holding down on this very top left one. And you'll see this will give you an explanation as well. So there's box select, which is where you drag a box and it will select within the box. There's lasso, where you draw a shape and it will select within the shape. And then there's circle select, which is like a brush. So you hold and click and it will select things in the shape of that, in the shape that you make. The one we want is maybe the lasso. It's probably the easiest for this specific thing. And I'm just going to lasso some shapes that seem kind of organic, like that. I'm going to hold shift so I can select some over here. Maybe I'll select these things, select some stuff over here, whatever it might be, leave a few gaps. And then I'm just going to tab out of edit mode without clicking anything. Go back to the snow sort of generator, the real snow generator. I'm going to say that I want the coverage to be maybe 80%, height 0.2 or so. And then I'm just going to press add snow. And it might take a little bit of a while. I also didn't tick selected faces, so it will add snow to all of this plane. So you can see it there. It's added snow to this whole plane, which is not exactly what we want. So I'll just press Ctrl Z, press selected faces. Maybe I want the height to be slightly more. It looked a bit shallow, so maybe I'll go up to 0.4. I want the coverage to be slightly less. And I'm going to press add snow again, but with the selected faces. And give it a second. So there we go. We've got some snow on the ground, more or less where we've selected, our squares before. And we can basically do this to every object in the scene. So the rocks, they're all one group, so we can just select the rocks, turn off selected faces because we're not really bothered, press add snow, and it will add snow literally just to the top of the rocks. So you see over here, and it starts to fall off around the side. So it's super easy. It's a really quick way of doing it. It works really well on objects that are, have some height to them. So things like these candy canes are also perfect. So if you shift select the candy canes, is that all of them? And then add snow, it will just add snow to the top. And very handily, it will add in a bunch of collections for snow. I can just group these all maybe and put them in a thing if I wanted, but there you go. We've got some snow on the scene. So the next thing we want to do is maybe add some snow that's falling into the scene. So some like a really quick particle system basically that allows us to have some snow kind of coming down. So the way to do this is to add in a plane that then acts as an emitter for the particles. So each individual little globule of snow. So Shift A, or actually I'll bring my cursor back to the middle. So my cursor, 3D cursor is over here. So if I added an object, Shift A and added a cube, it would be over here, but I want it to add over here. So similar to what I did in the very beginning, Shift S, bring up this menu and then cursor to world origin. We'll snap that little thing back to the very middle of the scene. And I want to Shift A, add a plane. Scale this plane up to basically be the same size as the ground plane. G and then Z, and just move it somewhere above the scene. So we obviously want our snow to fall from this plane down onto this plane. So the way to do this is to select that plane, and go down here, over on the right-hand side, come down to physics, which is below the little blue wrench, which is this kind of like little node looking thing. And then just add a new one. So over here on this little plus side, just add a particle system. And there's two types of particle systems. We're going to be looking at emitters in this one. And there's also hair. So hair will create strands of things. Emitters will create points and emit particles from those points. And then those particles get affected by various bits of physics in Blender. So if I come down here to this window, just come down here to something that I can see the timeline on. So over here to timeline. So any window, you can change what any window gives you visibility of over in the top left. So over here, come down, timeline. You'll see that my scene is here. And if I play a long time, scrub a long time, between 0 and 250 frames, if I press play, you'll see that the particles start to fall in the scene already without us doing a whole amount. And we could honestly leave it like this, you know, giant puffy snowflakes, giant sort of cylindrical snowflakes look pretty good. And for the sake of getting this under an hour in the tutorial, I might just leave them as spheres for now. But yeah, you'll see we'll play and some stuff happens. So if we go down here over into the properties of this particle system, it's going to look pretty intimidating, but it's not actually as scary as it seems, because a lot of these things we don't really need to get into now. So I'll just collapse all of these things. They may already be collapsed for you if you've never like entered into this menu before, but the kind of key ones are these first few, and then there's some other ones further down the line. So the number is how many of these things there are. So if at the moment the default was 1,000, if I set this up to 10,000, you'll see if I play through my timeline, there's even more of them. So now he's really stuck in a snowstorm. The frame start is exactly kind of what it says on the tin. So this will be the frame. So in this case, frame 1 of when it begins to emit particles. So you see on frame 0, there are no particles. On frame 1, there's some particles. And then as it goes along, it emits the particles from the plane. The end is when the plane stops emitting particles. So if I set this to frame 10, it would emit particles to frame 10, and then it would stop. So that has the effect of emitting all the particles in that time, and then none after frame 10. So if I pick the end as the end point of the frames that I have available in the scene, so 250 frames, now it will never stop emitting particles for the entire length of the scene that I have, before it loops back around to the beginning. So the lifetime is how long each particle lasts, so how long those little spheres last. And you'll see that it says 50 right now, so each particle, so each little sphere lasts for 50 frames before it disappears. And they all start to disappear around about this point in the scene, because it takes each particle 50 frames to get to that point, and then they disappear. So really, we don't need the particles to continue all the way down here, so we could mess around with this lifetime. You know, if we brought the lifetime down, say to 20, you'll see them start to disappear before they even actually hit the beast itself. So I'm just gonna leave this at 50 for now. And then leave it there. So the next thing we want to do, these are falling pretty fast, unless he was really, really caught in some sort of crazy snowstorm. You know, snow particles tend to fall pretty slowly. You know, they have a lot of drag, a lot of drag on them, so they fall quite slowly in real life. So there's a number of ways of doing this. We could get into the physics and like, you know, setting the specific mass of each of these particles and how much they are slowed by various bits of friction in the kind of metaphorical air of Blender's scene. But honestly, the easiest way to do this is to just tell Blender that gravity is less severe. So you come all the way down to field weights, and there's a bunch of stuff in here, and gravity is the first one. And you just want to turn this from 1 to maybe like 0.1. So as soon as we do this, you'll see that the particles start to fall a lot slower. And this looks weird right now. And that's because the lifetime of these particles isn't long enough at the moment. So at the moment, they are kind of all disappearing before they have any effect below here. So if we just increase this lifetime, say to like 200 frames, you'll begin to see that they start to fall slowly, and maybe 200 frames was way too long. I mean, we don't need the particles to kind of arrive all the way down here. So maybe somewhere around 100, just as a guess. Not actually sure. 150, somewhere like that. And the other thing that we might want to do is, because we're creating a still image, we don't actually need the particles to kind of emit from the plane from frame 1. Because we're creating a still image, we could tell Blender that all the particles should be already kind of in the scene for our camera to capture before it's even like started. So in frame start, we can turn this number to a negative number. So in effect, it will tell Blender that it starts the emission before we even begin to see it on our timeline. So before frame 0, in our case, 200 frames before frame 0, it will start the emission. So this has the effect basically of, what does this have the effect of? Bit of a brain freeze. This has the effect of basically meaning that we can create the still image from anywhere on the timeline. So, you know, from frame 1, rather than necessarily scrubbing through to frame 200 or whatever looked good. So we can start from frame 1 and all the particles are there for our camera to see. So just in the interest of time, I'm going to skip the next bit, but in the previous scene, I modeled up a little snowflake, and you can use anything that you model, so like a little sphere or whatever it might be. I mean, I'll just show that now. I'll just model a sphere. So over here on the right-hand side, just shift right click, and I'll just add in a small little UV sphere, scale it down, and this is going to be my single snow particle. And then I'm going to come back to my particle system over here, come down here, come down to render, and then this box here where it says render as path, halo, line, object, collection, you can press object and have it instance this sphere. So underneath object and then underneath object here, I can use this little eyedropper and I can just pick this sphere here. And you'll see it's now using this sphere, albeit it's very small right now, as the particle system itself. So you can mess with the scale of that thing up here. So I just need to increase the size of these things a little bit just so we can see them. So there you go. You see that it's actually that sphere rather than that previous thing that we had. And if you add a subdivision modifier to this, it will add to all of these particles. So I'll just right click, shade smooth, add a subdivision modifier, and you can see that all of these things get slightly smoother. So you know it's referencing this thing over here. So for the sake of this tutorial, I'll just leave these as little spheres. You know, snow particles kind of have they're like a flat disc shape, which you could spend some time modeling, or you could maybe find a snowflake and it might look really good. You could also have some varieties of different snowflakes, group them into a collection, and then reference the collection for the particle system. So you can have some varieties in the things, the shape of the things that are falling. Cool, so we got the basics of our scene. We got the snow, we got the candy canes, we got the rocks, we got the ground, and all that good stuff. And now we just need to light and texture, and this will be pretty quick. And I'll probably start with just adding some materials to all the basic things. So I'm just going to tick into viewport shading mode, which is this one over here in the top right. And you'll see that there's no material applied to any of these things, except for the snow, which I think has its own material applied. If I just zoom in, you'll be able to see that it's looking pretty snowy. So that already has all of its own material. We just need to give a material to the ground plane, the rocks, and the candy canes. So I'll start with the ground plane first. And rather than use the material editor over here, so rather than use this little circle. Oh, Stery's got a question. Sorry, Lost. What did you link the source of an UV sphere? In terms of in the particle system. So create your little UV sphere or your snow sphere or your snow disk. That's not what they're called. Snowflake. That's the word I'm looking for. Over here, when you're in and back looking at your emission, your particle system plane up here, and you just click it, come and scroll all the way down to render. So underneath render, which is below physics. And this first box here, where it says render as, you want to tick that to say object rather than path or halo or none. So object. And then underneath object, so underneath this second drop down here, the instance object you want to set to your sphere. So you can either just click in there and, search for it. So in my case, it's called sphere. So I could search for sphere, or you can use the little eyedropper over here and pick it from the scene. So once you click the eyedropper, you can just pick the object. So hopefully that answers that question. I hope that was the actual question. I haven't just answered something completely different. Cool. So yeah, we just need to add some materials to the grounds, the rocks, and the candy canes. So rather than do this through the material tab and material properties over here on the right-hand side, which is perfectly valid, by the way, I'm going to do it a different way using the shader editor. So I don't need this timeline anymore. So I'm going to switch this window over here in the top left. And I'm going to come down into shader editor over here. And this will at first show you absolutely nothing. And if let's just start with my ground plane. So select my ground plane. If I press and add new, you'll see that has the exact same effect of adding in a new material over here on the right-hand side. Only now it's got this kind of setup down here. And the shader editor is, I personally find it a lot easier to edit and think about materials in this way, but it does require a little bit of a learning curve, but it's honestly not as bad as it seems. So we'll start with some really basic stuff. So right here, this very first box is called the principal BSDF, and this is essentially just like a giant list of all the attributes that you can change about the material of this object that you've got. So there are a bunch of them, and we don't need to worry about any of them except for color for this one. So I'm just going to make the ground a little gray. So I'm going to change this base color, and you see as I move around, it's going to change color, and I just want a little gray, so it's a little bit different to the snow color there. Cool, and you'll see the base color here has changed, and we don't need to change anything else about this, just for now. And I'm going to then copy that gray onto the rocks. So I'm going to select the rocks, I'm going to shift select the ground, I'm going to link the two materials between the two, so I'm going to press Ctrl L to link, and link the materials. Once you link the materials, you see that the rocks have also gone gray, the ground is gray, the snow is white, and the only thing we have left to add a material to is the candy cane. So the candy cane's a little bit more tricky, but it uses a couple of different interesting kind of tools in this shader editor, which is kind of why I wanted to bring it up. So we'll click one of the candy canes, doesn't really matter which one. We'll add a new material, and we'll go from there. So we can tell Blender that we want the candy cane to be striped. So we need to tell Blender that the candy cane has to be a mixture of red and white. So in order to do this, we need to have another one of these nodes that does exactly that. And similar to the overall scene over here, where if you press Shift A, you can add anything in, you can press Shift A down here and add in a bunch of new stuff that relates to this whole kind of shader editor. So come down here, make sure your mouse is in this sort of box here, and press Shift A, and we're going to search for a color ramp. So search color ramp, the second one down, and add it in. And it will be black to white by default. And if we plug the color into the base color, you'll see that it changes to a gray. Broadly, whatever color the dot is here aligns to whatever color the dot is here. So gray ones into gray ones, yellow ones into yellow ones. Yellow ones can also go into a bunch of other things, but you know, green into green, purple into purple. I can't remember if there's another color, to be honest. So cool, we just need to tell Blender that this candy cane should be striped red and white. So on one end, one of these ends, which you can drag around, I'm going to change this color down here to some form of red. And then on the other end, I'm going to leave it white. But at the moment, you'll see that it's kind of giving us a gradient between red and white. So somewhere in the middle, it's kind of pink. And then the further up it goes, it's pure red. The further down this way it goes, it's pure white. We just want to tell Blender that it should just be a harsh edge. So we'll come over here. Rather than linear, we'll use constant. And we'll move this white thing maybe towards the middle, so 0.5. So you see it's red and white, and it's a solid divide between the two. There's no gradation between the two. And from here, we need to tell Blender exactly where to put that red and white along this object. So we need a few other nodes that also kind of daisy chain onto this one that we've just created. So again, Shift A. And this time we want to add in a wave texture. So I'll type in wave and wave texture. And again, we're going to plug one of these nodes into one of these nodes. So this is one of the cases where the color information from this node can derive, can kind of influence the factor. So the red or whiteness in our case of this node. So I'm going to plug this color into this factor. And you'll see once we do that, we've got some stripes. Now these stripes are kind of in the direction that we would like them to go, but not really. At the moment, they're just moving, you know, up and down, which kind of looks cool, to be honest. But you know, every candy cane I've ever seen has sort of horizontal stripes because of the way they're manufactured. So we just need to tell Blender a little bit more about how we want this wave texture to be governed. So again, we're going to add in another node. So you can see that it becomes quite sequential. You know, you kind of tell it one thing, then you tell it another thing, and you tell it a final thing. And the accumulation of all of those things gives you the result that you want. You could also do this in a number of different ways with UV maps and actual texture paints. So if you download an asset that is a candy cane rather than doing this in Blender natively, it will probably come with the diffuse maps, come with the color, come with these maps already kind of baked in. But since we don't want to get into UV unwrapping and texturing and things like that just yet, in this tutorial, we'll do it this way, which is creating a procedural material in Blender. So we just need to tell Blender a little bit more about where this wave texture should go. And in order to do that, we need to add in a couple more nodes. So we'll Shift A again and search, and we'll search for a mapping node, which is this purple one. And we'll Shift A final time, search for texture coordinate, which is this pink one. And these are the final two. And all these two things do is essentially just tell Blender where it should put the texture on the model. So we want to move the vector of this mapping node into the vector of this wave texture, so purple to purple. And you'll see it's kind of broken what we had before. And that's because we're not actually telling Blender exactly where to map that texture just yet. And the one that we want, there's a bunch of different options. The one we want is generated. So we want to put generated into this very first vector here. And once we do that, we get our stripes back to where we were originally without these two nodes. So if I just disconnect these two things, you'll see that nothing changes. But the advantage is we've now got this middle node, which means we can play with the angle, so the rotation of those stripes in any way that we want. And we want to come down to Y, and you'll see as I begin to twist this round, that the stripes start to come back round. All the way around, if you went through to 90 degrees, they'd be horizontal. We probably want somewhere around 70. I don't know. That's just a guess. So we've got this node here, which can control the angle of the stripes. We've got this node here, which controls the stripiness of the stripes. That's a bad way of explaining that. And we've got this node here, which controls the color of the stripes. So at any one point, we can change any of these things natively in Blender. So we can have the red thing here. We could change this to blue and pink and yellow and purple, whatever you want. We can change the scale of these stripes. So in this third thing here, so this orange one, where we're governing the wave texture itself, we could change the distortion of these things. So it could almost look like it was melting if you wanted that. 0 means there's no distortion. And we can change the scale. So this will be the higher the number, the more stripes there'll be. So the smaller the scale of the width of the stripe, and the lower the number, the chunkier they are. So maybe we want this to be, rather than 5, which I think was what it was on before, maybe it's like 2, so they're a bit chunkier. So now we've got a perfect candy cane there. And we can literally just copy and paste this material in the same way that we did with the rocks, all the way over onto all the other ones. So we can just shift select all of these candy canes, shift select the one you want to copy the material of last, Control L, link the materials, and you've got all the candy canes in all the colors. And you could go into any of these individual ones. So you could go into this one around the back. You could just duplicate that material. So if I just, if I called this candy and I press this button here, which is just a copy. So it adds a new material that's a copy of the original one. You'll see it's candy 001. If I added another one, it'd be candy 002 and all that sort of stuff. But once you make a new instance of that material, you can then change the color of all of these things independently. So, maybe I want a couple of different colors of candy cane for some reason. Like a blue one, a pink one, whatever it might be. So that's the advantage of coming into and out of this, so the shader editor, rather than necessarily messing around with the stuff over here, is you can start to create things that have a lot more editability, sort of for free, and they're all non-destructive. So you can kind of, you can at any one point you can get rid of any of these things, and it will go back to whatever material you had there previously. Cool. So there's the candy cane. I'm almost out of time, but I think we can squeeze in lighting and a bit of fog. So the next thing I want to add is just a little bit of volumetrics into the scene. So we want to make it feel kind of cold. We want to make it feel a little bit misty. And in order to do that, we just want to add in essentially a box of fog. So Shift A. Oh, sorry, I'll bring my cursor back to the middle again. You see my cursor's over here. 3D cursor's over here actually at the moment. A bit bigger. Yeah, my 3D cursor's over here next to the sphere. If I just Shift S, cursor to world origin, it will snap back here. Shift A, I'll add in a cube. I'm going to tab into edit mode. I'm going to scale that cube up so it covers the whole scene. G and then Z, move it up. It doesn't need to be quite as tall, so we can select this face at the top, G and then Z and move it down, somewhere like that. We've got a box over the whole scene. And while we have the shader editor up here, we can just add a new material to this box, so new. And this is another kind of benefit of using this setup rather than maybe the one over here. It's a little bit easier to see, to kind of see the impact of different materials kind of live, I guess. I find it a bit confusing over here, but we don't want this principled BSDF, so we don't want this green box because we don't want it to be a material necessarily. We want it to be a sort of essentially like a bunch of very small particles in the box. We want it to be a volume rather than a surface. So if we just delete the principled BSDF, so delete that, you'll see that when you delete it, there's no material applied, so it's just black. And we want to Shift A to add, and we want to search for volume, principled volume. So there's a bunch of options underneath volume, but principled volume is the one that we want. So if we add that in, you'll see it adds a green box back in, only it's different to the original green box. So rather than it being the principled BSDF, it's now the principled volume. And we want to plug the volume into the volume over here. And you'll see as soon as we do that, we kind of get a foggy box over the top of this thing. And we just want to change the density of the fog so it's less thick. So the density of the fog being this third thing down. So 0.1, maybe 0.2, just remove some of the haze. Maybe we want the color to be less dark, so we'll make it white. And if you've ever been outside, like in a, in a misty or a foggy day, and there's, there's a bright sun above you, all fog basically acts as like a diffuse light. So the light kind of bounces in from the sun or wherever it might be and bounces around, and you get a really flat and even light. So one really quick way of making something look really misty without doing too much effort is to add in a principled volume, set its white, set the density to something that looks good to your eyes, and then just turn up the emission strength slightly. So if I turn the emission strength to 1, you'll see that actually this whole box has begun to glow. But whereas if I turn it down to maybe 0.01, so honestly really, really fine, you'll see that the mist, rather than be black, it's slightly gray. And this will be more noticeable when I flick into rendered viewport shading. So if I go over here on the right hand side. Okay, so I'm in rendered viewport mode. I don't really have any lights in the scene beyond this one that I created earlier, which is this very small one over here. You can just see it. So there's no light in the scene, so you can't actually see anything at the moment. So I'm just going to turn that up. So I'm just going to move this up, G, and then grab. And I'm just going to turn the power of that light up to something much bigger. So I don't know, 5,000. And I'm just going to put it in the fog box so you can see what's going on. And then I think it looks like it crashed when I was adding the emission. So this box of fog has like no emission at the moment. So it's quite dark on the edges. If we just turn this up ever so slightly, you'll see how much that changes. So it now starts to look misty almost for free without much effort whatsoever. You might actually, just before I forget, want to add a snow material to your little snow particles as well. So you could copy the material from the real snow that we laid down earlier. So this kind of slightly glossy material, and just copy it over. So click your little snowball over here, shift click your snow over here, Control L, link the materials, and you see that all of those little guys have now got that snow material on. And actually, maybe this is also a nice illustrative point to end on, but the real snow that we added in comes already with its own sort of texture and material baked in. So if I click it, you'll see that there's this crazy setup of the material or shader editor as it is. And you'll see that most of it runs into this principled BSDF, which is this green box that we were playing around with earlier. And let's just say that you didn't like how shiny this was. Like you didn't want the snow to feel like it's maybe icy, and you wanted it to feel like it was kind of fresh and fluffy. You probably just want to up the roughness. So make sure you have that material selected rather than the fog box. Make sure you have that material selected and just crank the roughness up, higher. So then it starts to get rid of that glossy sheen, starts to look more like it's just settled. And yeah, you could keep working into this. If I just collapse that so you can see a little bit better, and I can toggle into my camera view, you can begin to see how we're setting up the bones of that scene that I showed earlier. One thing that might be useful as well, if you're looking through your camera, is to set up some depth of field on the camera. So make sure you have your camera selected, come down to your little green camera icon, and come down to depth of field, so underneath here, and just tick it on. And maybe you can pick your beast as the focus distance, so pick your beast, so use the eyedropper, pick the sheep balaclava. You can turn the f-stop down to increase the blurriness, so we'll just do 1.4 for now. So things in the foreground and the background will be blurrier than the things that are in focus by a significant amount. The lower this number, the blurrier it is. The higher the number, the less depth of field there is in the scene. So yeah, if you went a bit lower, things in the foreground would be a little bit more blurry. Things in the background would also be quite blurry. But this is quite handy if you've got, these little particle systems falling in front, falling in front of your character. The ones in the front will be kind of obscured in a nice way. The ones closest to your character will be still in focus, and the ones towards the back will be out of focus again. So yeah, I think this might be a good point to end it. If anyone has any questions on any of that, I'll jump into the Beast Lounge after this, and you can ask me kind of one-on-one. So yeah, thank you for staying with me for the last hour.